the Ultimate 7 project, which is my world first aim to journey from the lowest point in each continent to the highest, entirely by human power. The overall temperature swing from Death Valley to Denali was about 62 degrees, roughly. So where it was plus 32 in Death Valley, it was about minus 30 on the summit of Denali. Age 19, I was out in Beirut in Lebanon, living with a local family, bombs going off down the road and snipers on rooftops. There was one moment where my ski pole punctured through this snow bridge and I just had this black hole beside me. I put my other ski pole and that punched through as well. So I am an adventurer and expedition leader, and over the years I have specialized in taking people to some of the world's wildest, most remote places like Syria, Somalia, Congo, Yemen, Iraq, and really trying to push the boundaries of exploration. And I think more and more over the years, pushing my own physical boundaries with regards to endurance, with mountain climbing, cycling has become a bigger part of it. And so it is kind of finding that edge in various different ways, really seeing what is possible in my own unique sphere in which I operate.
I think a good place to start this is how you got into this, because in school you don't go to the careers officer and say, I want to take people around the world to some of the scariest places and experience these things myself as well. How did your life kind of get onto this path of doing what you do now?
Yeah, you're right. And it was never part of the plan. I never had this idea that, I'm going to be an adventurer. In fact, I wouldn't have even known what that meant probably for most of my youth. I grew up in Wigan in Northern England, pretty ordinary background, played lots of sports. We had a very good rugby league team at school. So we got to the national final kind of age 12, was playing at the Millennium Stadium in Cardiff in a national final. And in some ways that maybe was something which pointed me towards, I don't know, this idea of kind of performing highly, right throughout school. We've got this top sports team. We're being coached by top coaches and things like that. But I was that child in school who would stare out the window all the time. I'd want to be outdoors. I'd be coming up with schemes and plans and kind of breaking boundaries, bending rules here and there. But and then I remembered at the age of 17, I went for my first rock climbing experience. I'd never done it before, barely being out up into the Lake District and things. And for all of my childhood, you're getting told, no, don't do that. No, you can't do this. And now I'm up this, rock face. It feels high risk. And the guy down below, he's saying, carry on, keep going higher. He's not telling me to get back down. And I'm like, wow, this is what I've been chasing. Off the back of that, signed up to this 3-year degree course in outdoor leadership, did lots and lots of travel in my summers. I was going off to the Middle East, to Africa, North America, kind of pushing boundaries every year in my own way. Age 19, I was out in Beirut in Lebanon, living with a local family, bombs going off down the road and snipers on rooftops. And in many ways, it should have been frightening, but it was really exciting. And the adrenaline of it, I just loved. And so that was kind of the foundations of what was to come later down the line.
A couple of things we're going to get into from that 100% schemes and plans, because you're just back from a big scheme and a big plan. We'll get onto that in a bit. First, though, you kind of mentioned, being away when you're 17, 18 in these places where war is happening, where bombs are going off, where there's snipers on the roof. And I think you can kind of relate this to your whole life in terms of adventuring, probably. Does it sometimes feel a little bit strange just coming back?
Yes, that is a big theme. That has been a big theme throughout my life. And I think in some ways it is that process of coming back which has always drawn me back overseas onto future adventures. And there is certainly a come down after these experiences. You go from really intense, really wild moments, which are kind of hard to relate to a lot of people back home. I remember one example. I've been out in the Congo in Virunga National Park, absolutely wild place, probably the sketchiest place I've ever visited. And you've got militia groups, you've got kids with Kalashnikovs. It feels like something can kick off any moment. So you are so hyper alert. And then 48 hours later, I'm at home, going to the local supermarket to do my shopping, and it's that's the classic sort of movie scene, I suppose. But it is an adjustment period, and I think we get that. Anyone who's done ultra running events, marathons, big cycling events, whatever it might be, there is a come down after it, and we invest so much time and energy into these big goals. There can be a sort of void after that is complete and the job is done and you're back home. But I've learned over the years, you just got to ride the roller coaster. You got to just accept that that's going to happen. And you know what? That's good reason to plan the next adventure, which is what I've always done.
How do those experiences kind of make real life feel? I say real life. It is real life, of course, when you're out there. But I mean, when you're back in the day-to-day throes of everyday life, what does that feel like, having had those experiences?
I think one of the big things over the years is that, on these expeditions, you've got to be making really razor sharp decisions. You've got to have absolute attention to detail. You can't be complacent. In some places, everything you do pretty much could have real consequences, real immediate consequences, possibly even fatal consequences if you make the wrong decision. And I think spending so long in environments like that, where you're operating at that kind of level, then coming back into a normal environment, certainly one of the, I think, real benefits is that, I don't really get stressed. I don't, I really feel very calm. And I think it just helps me reflect on the fact that a lot of ordinary things that we face in life, they're really quite trivial, and I just don't get too hung up on them. It gives you a whole new perspective, I think, on what's important, what to focus your energies and emotions on. And, I always kind of smile to myself when, say, I'm in an airport. Everybody gets so stressed in airports. I don't know what it is about that environment, but, I just kind of sit back and observe it and find it quite amusing because, at the end of the day, you're in this air-conditioned airport. You're about to go on your holidays, have a great time with your family, chill out, enjoy it. So I think that's one thing, but also it's just appreciating those small things. And for sure, I've spent a lot of time in, places where the third world countries, and essentially there's very little amenities, and so it really does give you a deep appreciation of how fortunate we are. Just things like having a fridge full of food, having a warm house, having running water in your kitchen, all of those things. It just recalibrates how grateful I feel. So that's been a couple of the things.
I can't remember who I was talking to about a similar thing, but they were talking about getting back from one of these expeditions and going to the kitchen and turning on the tap and just staring at it for 30 seconds, like they hadn't had that for a couple of months or whatever. And then that is just something you take for granted so much. And I'd imagine those day-to-day things that sometimes we do take for granted, when you do come back, you're like, we need to appreciate kind of the world we live in, this side of the globe.
Yeah. I mean, this latest expedition is a perfect example for that. I mean, for sure, in places like Africa, in the Middle East, it's a different issue of trying to get water, make sure it's sterile, make sure it's clean, and you're drinking good quality stuff. But in Denali, which I'm sure we'll get into in Alaska, to get a drink of water, you need to go out in a blizzard, out into -20, -30, gather some snow, bring it back in, spend about 2 hours, melting that snow over a stove with freezing cold hands. And then eventually, you can get a drink at the end of that. So it does reframe things. Absolutely.
You mentioned schemes and plans before, and let's get on to this current expedition that you've just back from, because it's one of my favorites that I followed. I absolutely loved it.
Thank you.
Just explain kind of what you've just got back from, and I believe it was like 10 years in the making. So what are those 10 years before this?
Yeah. So, to fast forward through that period, I'd left university, did a load of travel for a year, got home, fell into a job I didn't like, quit that job in 2015 after 2 years of kind of miserable existence, and committed to this life of adventure, and did lots of big expeditions, got into guiding groups. And all throughout that period, I was keeping like a bucket list of ultimate expeditions that I could do. And occasionally I would look back at it, and some of them, they would fade away, they'd fizzle out. But there were certain ideas which really stuck. And this was one of them right from the start. But I always knew that to pull it off would require, me to really improve my skills, my endurance, my experience, my understanding of planning big expeditions. It would be expensive. It would be logistically extremely complex. And so there were many kind of barriers, which meant it stayed there. It stayed there on the list. And I'd think about it every so often. But I didn't feel ready to pull the trigger and make it happen. And what the project is, the overall project is something I describe as the Ultimate 7 project, which is my world first aim to journey from the lowest point in each continent to the highest, entirely by human power. So that is 7 expeditions. It's a long multi-year project across all of the 7 continents. In total, it will involve about 15,000 miles of human-powered travel, cycling, skiing, climbing, even rowing on one particular section. It is, it's a world first. Nobody's ever done this, and it will involve overall almost 500 days of actual time on expeditions. And so I decided to finally commit to this about 18 months ago. And that involved a lot of sacrifices. It involves really stepping out there and, putting this dream out into the world, which, by the way, I think is often one of the biggest steps for anyone taking on a big goal. It's, putting it out there and like releasing it from just swimming around your mind. And that adds a certain pressure and accountability, I think, which is an important step to making it happen. And so last summer I did the Africa leg of the project, which was had many of its own challenges. It was a 1,600-mile journey, baking hot temperatures, cycling on highly chaotic roads, having people throwing rocks at me, even throwing a knife at me, dodging wild animals, and then cycling in temperatures up to 45 degrees, and eventually climbing up Kilimanjaro at the end, which. To be fair, I've done that before, so that did feel like the easier part. It was the ride that was like the real hard part, and so that was great. I ticked off the first one, and now it's on to number 2, the second leg, and that was always going to be the big one. This was going to be the real challenge, and this is the North American leg. And so the project in North America is to go from Death Valley to Denali, so lowest point in the continent to the highest. Death Valley is way down in Southern California. Denali is all the way up in Northern Alaska. The distance between those 2 points is about over 3,500 miles. So that's the equivalent of London to Dubai as a straight line. In fact, it's a bit longer, or London to Washington, D.C., just to put that in context. So it's a vast continent. And it came with a lot of logistical problems to overcome in terms of timing, in terms of accessing different parts of the country in different seasons. I'm going from the hottest point in North America to probably the coldest point in North America, which means to piece all of this together in the right season would be very, very difficult. I'd also need to go through places which, is very scarcely visited. There's very little research done about them. And so I knew it would be, the biggest, toughest project that I would take on. And it's never been done this century. It's been done once in history, back in the 90s. A few people have tried it since. They've not managed to do it. And so I was attempting to become the first person this century to complete the challenge.
I know you've done all these things in the past. And like you say, this one was going to be one of the biggest. Did it feel like that experience, that toolbox you've kind of put together over the last 10 years came into play when organising this? Because as you've already said, I would imagine an absolute logistical nightmare.
Yeah, absolutely. It wouldn't have been possible if I think about it, and I'm really honest with myself. If I was to try this 10 or even 5 years ago, I don't think I would have succeeded. It's really required a very deep understanding of planning, of considering risks, of good decision making, of bringing in a real world class team, which is what I needed to do for the mountain phase. And if I was to think about, which I did, all of the things which go wrong, which is often a good place to start, I describe it as becoming a student of failure, and that might sound negative or pessimistic, but it's really not that, and it doesn't affect my mental state. But you really do need to think about all of the potential things that could go wrong, because that is how you build a robust plan. If you don't have a good understanding of all the possible pitfalls, you could come unstuck if you face them and you're not prepared for it. And even going as far as, reading old expedition reports from people who are going up Denali and encountering problems and people getting killed and all these different things, you're going into an extremely severe environment. And if you're not ready, you could pay the ultimate price. And so I needed to have absolute attention to detail. And to put in context, what that looks like, once I'd assembled this team, just as one example, we once had a 15-minute conversation about the optimum size of pan for our stove, and we probably had 300 items on our kit list, and it was the same with everything. So it's consider every risk, and really leave no stone unturned, because the slightest misstep or mistake can have real consequences. And that was absolutely critical on this expedition.
It feels mad even calling it a start line, to be honest. But when you got to the start line in Death Valley, of course we've spoken about Death Valley a lot on this podcast. Some incredibly famous ultra races, of course, through Death Valley. But you're going from one of the driest, hottest, most barren places on Earth to, you've definitely got some of those things at the top of Denali in terms of the barrenness, but you've got a totally different kind of weather system and what you're experiencing up there. From the start line to the top of Denali, just try and explain the just stark difference of the two places.
Yeah, it is absolutely stark. They might be on the same continent, but it feels like they're worlds apart. And as you say, Death Valley is an extremely arid, almost moon-like environment. There's no life down there as far as I could see. There's no civilization down there. Nobody lives there. In the summer, I think just recently, it's reached about 55 to 57 degrees. It's just insane. Mercifully, I was there in late March, but it was still low 30s, which is, still pretty hot on the bike. But it's very, very dry, very arid. And it's a strange place to start in many ways, because the exact low point is a place called Badwater Basin, which is a dried up salt lake. You get a few tourists going down there. I remember the morning I was traveling there, I was coming in from Las Vegas, and I was slightly sleep deprived, slightly jet lagged. I'd built out my bike, having packaged it up, loaded it up with all of that kit. And I remember before I traveled there, I sat in my hotel, in the hotel room in Las Vegas, just staring at this bike for 5 minutes, 5 long minutes, just thinking, what am I about? What am I doing here? What am I about to go through? And that I think you get so caught up with the planning and everything that was when it really hit me. What I was about to take on, this journey of 3,500 miles, much of which was be on my own. And which would take about 10 weeks. And then traveled out to Death Valley, a few tourists there, a couple of them took some pictures and, were quite interested in the journey. And then I was off. And to answer your question about comparing it, the overall temperature swing from Death Valley to Denali was about 62 degrees, roughly. So where it was plus 32 in Death Valley, it was about minus 30 on the summit of Denali. When with wind chill, it felt like about minus 38 actually. So yeah, the swing was huge, and that of course has implications for how you plan it. The kit you take, and being absolutely dialed into the right environment when you're there.
The reason I ask about that stark difference is because I imagine that, like people do on a smaller scale when it comes to marathons or ultra races or even, a 10K, you break it down, don't you? You think, okay, well, a marathon is X amount of 5Ks and a little bit at the end, or a 10K is a couple of 5Ks, or however you want to break these things down. How did you manage to break that down? Because with such stark difference throughout the challenge, it must have been, in some ways, slightly easier to just kind of compartmentalize, right, this part's this bit this part's this bit, this part's this bit, put it all together, make the jigsaw of the overall challenge.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely crucial to break it down. Such a long journey like that. If I set out on day one thinking about just how far I've got to go, or any day for that matter, thinking about the distance left, it's just going to drive you crazy. So you've got to break it down on a daily basis, sometimes even an hourly basis. Where am I going to get to? Where's my next break? How far am I going to push today? And I did need to break it down. I think one of the first big milestones was to make it to the Canadian border. That felt like it would be a big milestone. In some ways, I thought that would be the easy part, is just getting up to the Canadian border, which meant going, what was it, probably 1,200 miles or so, up through Nevada, Idaho, Oregon, Washington State, and to the border. But 3 days in, I'm in Nevada. I've sort of left the heat behind. I'm now going through blizzards, extreme headwinds in Nevada, extremely remote. My body is in absolute bits because my bike weighs 50 kilograms. All my tendons are screaming at me, swollen. I'm taking painkillers to sleep at night. Of course, I'm out there on my own. You've got nobody rallying you, supporting you. You've just got to rally yourself, keep motivated. And that was, I really had to dig deep mentally and just find reasons to keep pushing and to keep going. I would say it took about 2 weeks to get through that period and for my body to start to adjust. I do think with any big challenge, if the challenge is big enough and hard enough, there's always going to be a pain barrier. If there's not a pain barrier, it's probably not a hard challenge for you. And you've just got to accept that. And one of the big things is getting through that initial pain barrier, I think. Once you're through that, not only does that strengthen your mind, but it's also evidence to yourself that you can do it. And so it took me a couple of weeks to adjust to it, and then I could start to make good progress and get into the swing of it. But it was just trying to break it down as much as possible.
What were those most difficult moments, those times where, you say that you're reminding yourself, you're trying to stay motivated, but sometimes motivation is very hard to come by when you're faced with serious adversity, and there would have been many of those moments. Just try and handpick a few, because I'm sure there's more than fingers and thumbs of amounts.
Yes, there are a lot, and for me, it just comes down to sticking to that routine, or having things in place that you almost robotically you need to do. For instance, in those first few days, getting up in the morning, I was struggling to walk. My body's absolutely killing me, and I know that I need to go and get on the bike. I cannot afford a rest because I'm already falling behind schedule. I've set myself a really high bar in terms of schedule and daily distances. I needed to average about 90 miles and about 1,200 meters climbing a day. With this 50 kilogram bike in all weather conditions, I could not afford to let up. If anything, I needed to push harder. And so what I would do is just be, like I say, almost robotic. Like, I know I need to get up. I need to have some breakfast. I definitely relied on caffeine a bit as well. I need to just sort my kit out, make sure everything's organized, make sure I've got plenty water in, and just get on the bike and start turning those pedals, and have a time that I'm going to do that by, and just being really strict with myself. You've got to set these boundaries. If you don't have a clear idea of what you're going to do, it's all too easy for you to just let off and let things slip. So if nobody's there to enforce the rules on you, you've got to do it by in your own way. I feel.
When did it feel like you'd really kind of broken the back of it? Because, like you say, at the start line, it's so far ahead of you. You're breaking it down day by day. Are you continually doing that right until the summit of Denali, or are you getting to a point and thinking, right, Oli, you've got this now?
Yeah, it was. I would say after about 3 weeks on the bike, I felt physically really good. I was on track. I'd caught up. I'd pushed really hard. My body was feeling a bit better, but certainly there were still many doubts, because everything from there north, and I'm now in central British Columbia. I've got to go way up into the Yukon territories, which is exceptionally remote. I think it's about 3 times the size of the UK with about 80,000 people. I'd be going through areas where it's 330 miles between towns in one particular area. Very, very remote. You've still got heavy snowfall. You've got blizzards. You're entering bear country as they're coming out of hibernation. And that's before you even consider the mountain, which which was a whole nother thing, and actually getting to the mountain, which maybe we can touch on. But so it was, to be honest, it was never, ever in the bag in my mind. The only moment I allowed myself to believe that it was in the bag was when I was 100 meters from the summit. Up until that point, I could not allow myself to switch off mentally and just believe that it was automatically going to happen. I had to stay absolutely dialed in every single day.
You mentioned the summit, but like you just mentioned as well, there's a big journey even to the bottom of the mountain. Talk me through that.
Yeah, so it was kind of a 3-stage journey. So you had the 6-week cycle. Once I completed that, I got there just in time into the foothills of Denali National Park. And Denali National Park, huge area of mountains, rivers, forests, foothills, glaciers, true Alaskan wilderness, off the charts, the scale of this area. And I essentially cycled as far up the road as possible, and that was the end of the cycle leg. Now, with Denali, most people fly directly into the base camp, which is way up on something called the Kehiltner Glacier. They've then got the ultimate climb up the mountain, which is probably in distance terms, maybe 25 kilometers from base camp to the summit. For us to get to base camp and for me to complete this journey by human power, we needed to travel overland on skis and on foot all the way to base camp, which was a distance of 122 kilometers. So it's like 5 times the distance of just that climb that most people are doing. And, nobody does this, or only a tiny number of people have done it over the years. The best source of information I had was a guy who did it literally 20 years ago, and he shared some photos and some information with me. 20 years is a big amount of time, and lots of things could have changed, and so there were so many uncertainties. So to get to this base camp, we needed to do this 122 kilometer journey. We needed to cross through foothills, hack through forests, cross frozen rivers, get up onto this glacier, travel along the glacier where there are huge crevasses which could swallow skyscrapers, where there are avalanches coming down. Lower down the mountain, you're trekking through bear country essentially. And if I was to fail, I wouldn't even get a crack at the mountain essentially. So to make that happen, I needed to assemble, I touched on it, this world-class team essentially, which included, a friend of mine who is an elite individual who loads of cold weather and mountain experience, another guy who's a pro skier, lots of steep terrain experience, and another guy who, is a world record holding adventurer. So it was, everybody has got a real high caliber of performance and ability and skill, and they're all good people. It would have been impossible without a team, of that caliber. And so we had to push really hard. We had to be very mindful of the risks. We had to be absolutely prepared. It took us 8 days to get to base camp, in which time we didn't see any other humans. Just us. We had bear prints by our tent, 20 meters from our tent, huge grizzly bear prints. It's quite terrifying. And we did have some protection with us. We had revolver and flare guns and bear spray and all sorts of things. And then, on the glacier, we were trekking across these, as I say, the huge crevasses. And I remember there was one moment where essentially these crevasses, for anyone who doesn't know, you've got these glaciers, which are huge masses of ice. Within that ice, you've got massive cracks, which could be 100, 200, 300 meters deep, who knows? And often they're covered by just a very thin crisp of snow sort of bridging across the top of this enormous hole. And so you're constantly skiing over these snow bridges. Essentially, you don't know where these crevasses are often. there was one moment where my ski pole punctured through this snow bridge, and I just had this black hole beside me. I put my other ski pole in, that punched through as well. And now I'm just teetering on my skis over this huge void, which is quite terrifying. And so, yeah, that was an eventful journey. Very, very difficult, very complex. We had to push hard. By the time we got to base camp, we were down to our last few snacks. And then we'd organised a resupply. And then, then we could try and climb this mountain, which historically, or last year, of the 900 people, for context, who tried to climb Denali last year, all of whom are vetted, all of whom are highly experienced, only 30% of them summited. So still now, I've cycled 6 weeks, we've gone through that really hard section, and now we're on a mountain where there's only 30% summit success rate last year. And so there were still many, many question marks and many hard moments to come.
Does it feel like, when you're talking about it, because obviously recounting it is amazing because it's something that you've done and like a place that you've been in, an experience you've experienced, but were you able to kind of appreciate it when you were there? Because when you're talking, like, you're obviously so passionate about how you talk about it, but because there's so many things you're considering, almost like it's only now really that you can kind of appreciate what you did. In the moment, it's a bit like, I just need to not fall down this 300-meter hole.
Yeah. Part of it is that, to be honest, and that's what we call type 2 fun, isn't it? That's, in the moment, sometimes it's grim and it's hard and you're questioning your life choices. But the fun or the enjoyment only comes afterwards, and kind of hindsight can be very generous in that way. But, absolutely, there were moments where, I remember on that ski approach, we'd kind of got through all of the more difficult terrain. And now we're skiing along. We got the sun beating down on us. We've got great big mountains either side. You've not seen any people for days. Only a handful of people have ever been here. And for me, that moments like that are really special. That is why I do these adventures. That's why I spend so much of my time planning them, thinking about them, because you get these incredible once in a lifetime moments. And so there were many, many flashes like that throughout the journey. Where you really got to pinch yourself and just think, wow, I'm so lucky to be actually doing this, and this is what all the hard work is for.
Once in a lifetime moments, you mentioned that phrase there, and there is actually a video on your Instagram, which if anybody hasn't seen, go and check it out. I'll put the link in the description of the podcast, of you summiting Denali or moments after the fact. And there is definitely that look of joy, that once in a lifetime moment kind of feeling on your face. That journey up to that point, just talk me through that 30% of people, like you say, only summiting Denali after being vetted, etc. That must have felt very special, not only because of that fact, but because of all the distance that came before.
Yeah, it did. And as I said before, it never felt like it was in the bag. And if anything, a theme of the whole expedition was escalating risk. So the further and deeper I got into it, the higher the risk became, and the higher the chance that things could catastrophically go wrong. For real, and in a very serious way. And so, we really had to stay switched on. And so we were feeling good. We've made good progress. We got to base camp. We resupplied our sleds. We stocked up. There you've got a few other groups dotted about. They're making progress up the mountain. But we kind of hit it hard. We've got this strong team. We're already feeling very cohesive, working well together. And we managed to push up to something called 14K camp, which is kind of the last big, I suppose, safe refuge on the mountain, where you're about 4,500 meters up, but you're in pretty safe terrain. And you can sort of acclimatize up there, prepare to push on for the summit. And we got there in about 4.5 days, and often takes teams 10, 12 days to get up there. So we were making good progress. And then a storm came in, and a storm lasted about 6 days. And so we were essentially stuck in our tents for the best part of that 6-day period. In between the blizzards, we would get out, we would build these snow walls around the tents. We would play cards, melt water, make plans, listen to the weather reports in the evening, which the park rangers put out on a radio. In that time, when we got a chance, we would progress up the mountain and back down for extra acclimatization, or to drop gear and stash gear higher up. And I remember one morning, just to touch on the severity of it, but not to dwell on it really. But there was one morning I'd been messaging back and forth with my daughter via this satellite tracking device. 3 years old, missing her, of course, but also trying to keep those emotions at an arm's length. But certainly, I was thinking about her that morning, and then we climbed up a little higher that day, and up this very, very steep icy section onto a very steep ridge at over 5,000 meters now. And as we got up there, we saw a helicopter flying across with a stretcher underneath. And sort of me and my teammates looked at each other. We all knew what that meant, but we didn't speak about it at the time because it wasn't the time or the place. But unfortunately, that was a climber who had died in a fall a few days earlier and been flown off the mountain. And so, that again focused our minds. And in many ways, on an expedition like this, it's about holding your nerve and really sticking to your guns, but also making sure that you're not being complacent. And so we as a team, we talked about, not being complacent and really making good decisions. And so that helped to focus our minds. But it was also a reminder of the severity of this mountain. A few days later, we were able to push up to the final high camp, now at 5,500 meters. This is a place where you don't want to hang around for too long because you can just get absolutely hammered by the wind, by hurricane force winds, brutal cold. It's about minus 26, minus 27 when we were there. The sort of cold which just saps away at you. And then, eventually we waited out for the perfect weather day, and we pushed on up the mountain. We were walking, climbing for about 10 hours on various bits of steep terrain, including that section where the person had fallen a few days earlier. And but all the way keeping absolute focus, working well as a team, communicating well, making good progress. And then eventually we made it up to the final summit ridge, and I could see the summit, 100 meters away. The clouds sort of cleared just at the right time. The wind wasn't too bad. It was very, very cold, no doubt about it. But and that was the first time that it really felt in the bag. And the feeling of getting onto the summit was just, it's hard to describe. It's a moment I'll never forget. It was a combination of all kinds of emotions, deep satisfaction, bit of euphoria, relief, and just absolute joy at doing it with this incredible team of individuals who become very close friends. So that was just this remarkable experience.
I was going to say it must have felt even more special because of the people that you were with and those moments that you'd faced over that time, like skiing in, getting to that point, then climbing this mountain that is climbed up by very, very few. Reflecting with them after the fact, what was that like?
Yeah, it was phenomenal, and in some ways we still had to get back down, of course. So you get to the summit, you're only halfway in a sense, and so we had to turn back and again really concentrate, make sure the fatigue wasn't getting in the way of our decision making, and get ourselves down off the mountain. And then, finally, having had this long human-powered journey over the last 10 weeks, we got on a ski plane down at base camp. So the journey's now complete, and that means we're going to fly out of there. And that was just this incredible way to finish the journey. It was kind of bizarre because we'd spent so long in these wild Alaskan mountains, completely cut off from the outside world. We had no phone signal for 3.5 weeks. And then we're on this ski plane flying out, and within 45 minutes or an hour, we landed back in civilization, and then we're straight into the pub, and it was just this really weird feeling. We didn't shower, so I apologize to anyone sat near us in the pub, but yeah, it was just incredible. So we had a bit of a blowout, admittedly.
I can imagine. I think you deserved it. I think you've also in the past 10 minutes named your autobiography. I like exceeding risk.
Escalating risk.
Escalating risk.
Yeah.
I mean, mate, that's incredible. And like, looking forward now, because this is part of a bigger jigsaw puzzle again. What is next? How do you move on to the next thing? Because I would imagine your head is always filled with ideas, or trying to schedule things, or thinking about risks, or thinking about these next adventures you're going to be going on.
Yes. Yes. So, as I mentioned, this is part of the larger Ultimate Seven project, which is 7 separate expeditions. So, I'm now 2 down. I've done the Africa leg, I've done the North America leg, so 5 remaining. So, it's still really just the beginning of this project. I'm really starting to feel, after so long of trying to knock on doors, trying to build this project from the seeds of an idea, I feel very fortunate to have got some good traction now, got some good brand support, got quite a lot of press out of the last expedition, and so I'm planning towards the third leg, which is South America in the winter, which is 5-week expedition. Will also be very challenging, very windy, very cold mountain, higher actually than Denali, although a little less technical. And so that's the next plan. But certainly, if you look ahead to the rest of this project, there are some big, big, big ones, including the Asia leg, which is Dead Sea to Everest through 9 countries, 4,500 miles. I'm already putting the work in on that one. That one will, of course, be a bit more expensive, more time consuming. But for sure, there are a lot more to come.
Will that one be last?
Potentially, we'll see. Antarctica is also going to be very complex, very expensive, possibly even more so than Everest. So maybe that one will come last. We shall see. But there's lots of other things to consider other than the difficulty. It's the bureaucracy, it's the permits, it's the funding, the sponsorship. All of these things. In some places, political situations, security situations. So, Europe, for example, Europe is all in Russia. And so right now that one is kind of on hold until things clear up there. It's biding my time, but the aim is to make them all happen and to achieve this goal.
Mate, it's an amazing goal to have. And I guess just a couple more. When you look at this from like a wide scope, how does this project now make you feel? Now you're in it. It's not just in a notebook. You're 2 deep out of 7. What are your feelings towards it?
Yeah, good question. And it is, it's an incredible feeling because you spend so long wondering if something is possible. And I think eventually you've just got to do it. You've got to do it and find out if it's possible. That's the only way you're going to find out. You're not going to find out by sitting, wondering, worrying, thinking about doubts and fears. You've got to try it. But for sure, this North America one was a big ask mentally, and I didn't know if it would be possible. So it is an incredible feeling. And I think, if anything, it has really made me feel empowered towards the future legs. I've taken this on. I did everything in the right way, and it was a success. And as far as it goes, I believe very, very little went wrong. And there could have been a lot of things going wrong on that expedition. So it's a huge confidence boost, absolutely. But I'm always mindful that you've got to keep that confidence in check in a way, and not let yourself get carried away. I think one of the things that's kept me alive through a lot of hairy situations has been trying to stay just focused, not get too carried away. But absolutely, I feel like I could take on the world right now after completing this expedition.
I guess it's just keeping that attention to detail that you've built up, and just keeping going back to that toolbox of things that you now know, the knowledge you now have, isn't it? And not being like,
yeah.
Oh, okay, I've done this, so this one's going to be a lot easier, which I know you won't do, but I guess sometimes just reminding yourself of that must be super important. There'll be a lot of people listening to this now that are hearing this and feeling very inspired, I'm sure, but won't be able to do something quite as big. Their life is an adventure. They don't have that toolbox, but there are things that obviously people can do on a day-to-day basis to maybe bring a little bit more of that into their own lives. Just to finish, what would be your advice to somebody that is maybe looking to inject a little bit of adventure or a little bit of something different into their day-to-day?
Well, I believe that we as humans are all explorers. I believe that is what separates humans from all other species on Earth. It is that curiosity. It is that will to find out what lies in the unknown. If we didn't have that, we'd still be living in jungles and caves. We've used that exploration, or that love for exploration, to branch out, to populate the entire globe, to explore the mountains, deep space, the ocean. And so we all have that within us. But I think one of the sad things is in modern world, a lot of those instincts we're ignoring and we're allowing them to be eroded. And so I think, what I've seen over the years, I've taken about 500 people on expeditions right across the world from literally all walks of life. And I've seen time and again that no matter who, what their background are, and some of them have been billionaires, CEOs, ex-CIA officers, elite high performers. And every single time I've seen that people have the will and the capacity and the ability to do more than what they perceived was possible. And so that has convinced me that that is true for us all. I have no doubt about that. And I think a lot of the limitations that we feel we have are self-imposed. We allow those limitations to stop us from taking on difficult things. And so, my message is believe that you can do something really hard and see that often the very best things, the most exciting things in life, in my experience over the years, lie in the unknown. You just got to be willing to take that step. And if nobody else will back you, you can still back yourself. Just be willing to take that first step, back yourself and make it happen and enjoy the ride, because we only get to do this once.